I'd like to welcome our chief guest, Professor Dr. Ricky J. Lee. He is adjunct professor of law at University of Notre Dame, Australia. He is one of the world's leading experts in space law, having acted for launch operators, satellite operators, regulatory agencies, and government entities around the world. He has been in legal practice for 2 decades and admitted to practice in Australia and New Zealand. He has published over 120 books, chapters, articles, and seminar papers to his name on space law, international law, and commercial law. It's truly an honor to have you amongst us. Sir, please.
I would just like to say, Professor Bhatt, Professor Khan, and Professor Kumar, thank you very much for your kind invitation. I'm truly humbled to join with the three of you in this inaugural session of this conference. The topic that I've chosen to speak on is to talk about the Moon Agreement. I'm grateful to Professor Bhatt for his very comprehensive and informative presentation on the legal issues arising from privatization based on the 4 United Nations space treaties that India is a party to. What I wish to do is to spend a little bit of time focusing on the one treaty that India is not a party to and the commercial and practical implications of that, particularly with the prospect of space mining that may arise in the next few decades to come. So, just as an overview of what I propose to talk about, I want to first of all give a short overview as to the prospects of mining in space. Why would we go mine in space and what is there to mine for us? Then I want to run through very quickly the basic tenets of the Moon Agreement and the current controversies in relation to the Moon Agreement. India's status as a signatory rather than a party of the Moon Agreement, and also to talk about some very recent developments in the field of space mining and the regulation of space mining in the form of the Artemis Accords that have been negotiated between the United States and 6 other countries just in the last few months, and what I would suggest would be the next steps for India going forward if India is to play a prominent role in future either governmental or private space mining. So to give a brief overview as to why we should mine in space, there are 2 concepts that we need to grapple with. The first is resource scarcity. From a very young age, I have read about how there are predictions as to when we will run out of mineral resources on Earth that we currently consume. For example, we were supposed to run out of petroleum in another 30 years' time. We're supposed to run out of coal in 60 years' time. We're supposed to run out of natural gas in 80 years' time. But more importantly, also with minerals and metals, we're supposed to run out of aluminium in about 70 years' time. We're supposed to run out of iron in about 120 years' time. These predictions are based on the concept of absolute scarcity. It's based on the idea of, well, how much of these minerals are we currently using? And what do we estimate are the resources that are available in the Earth's crust that we can actually extract and be able to use? The problem with the idea of absolute scarcity is that they are always preceded by economic scarcity, which is the second concept that we have to grapple with. Economic scarcity arises where it is simply not worthwhile to extract certain minerals from certain mines. There are certain factors that may arise, that may cause this to arise. The first is that the quality of the mine may not be sufficiently rich for that to happen. Secondly, the environmental damage may be too substantial. Thirdly, it may be located at a place that was simply too hard to get to. As an example of how economic scarcity may arise, 120 years ago, in order to extract a single ounce of platinum, one would process about half a ton of ore in order to extract that 1 ounce. Today, 120 years later, to extract 1 ounce of platinum, it now takes on average about 5 tons of ore to be processed. The quality of mineral ores are declining just as much as the accessibility of these mineral reserves on Earth are getting harder, both in terms of practical sense and also in an environmental sense. The good thing for humanity as a whole is that many of these mineral resources are available in some abundance in space, particularly on asteroids. And it is recognizing this that there are quite a few enterprises such as Alphabet, which is the holding company of Google, and also some governments that don't intrinsically have a space industry of their own, have recognized the potential of space mining and want to get ahead of other countries and other businesses in being able to access the abundances of space resources. Well, as Professor Barr suggests, the law should precede the practice. So one attempt on the part of the international community to provide the legal basis for space mining came about in the Moon Agreement. It is the last of the 5 United Nations space treaties. It was finalized in 1979, and it entered into force in 1984. It has been ratified by only 18 state parties. By comparison, the Outer Space Treaty is ratified by over 120 countries, but only 18 has ratified the Moon Agreement. And I apologize for the abbreviations. They were supposed to be flags, but when they transposed to PowerPoint, obviously the flags didn't go with it. For that, I apologize. Apparently, emojis are not as universal as one may think. But just to run them through very quickly is Armenia, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Chile, Kazakhstan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Mexico, Morocco, the Netherlands, Pakistan, the Philippines, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Uruguay, and Venezuela. One common thread you would probably observe about these countries I've just listed is that most of them don't have a mature space capability. Arguably, Kazakhstan has a mature space capability, but that's very much transplanted from Russia, from the Soviet days. Australia may be said to have some space capability, but Australia doesn't launch its own space objects. They launch it overseas, though Australia do have a significant fleet of satellites. The other countries are at varying stages of advancement in terms of space industry, but none of them are certainly to the scale of maturity and scale that India has achieved in its space sector. There are 4 states that have signed it but not ratified the Moon Agreement, and they are France, Guatemala, India, and Romania, of which, as you no doubt would observe, only France and India are mature space powers. So among the field of states that have either signed or ratified the Moon Agreement, India is in a unique position where it has a significant, mature, and well-developed space sector. But unlike most of the Western countries and industrialized countries that chose not to participate in the Moon Agreement, it is also a very commercialized sector, though it is very much dominated by government and public needs. The most important part of the Moon Agreement, and also the most controversial part of the Moon Agreement, is Article 11. And Article 11 designates space resources as a common heritage of mankind. And it foreshadows, it doesn't create, but it foreshadows a regime whereby there would be some sharing of the benefits that may be derived from the use of space resources. During the negotiations over the Moon Agreement, the industrialized countries and the developing countries could not agree as to the content, the substance of what benefits are going to be shared and how much of those benefits are going to be shared. In 1978, it was India that proposed a compromise. It was that we will put off the creation of the regime and therefore the determination of how the benefits from space resources are to be shared into a future point in time. In the meantime, there would be no moratorium on countries doing mining activities. That compromise ultimately became embodied in the Moon Agreement that was adopted in 1979. So there is a future regime that is supposed to be created where there will be some sharing of resources as either a percentage or some kind of benefit, some other practical benefit, or maybe the commodities themselves that may need to be shared. But in the meantime, you can do whatever you want because there is no moratorium in space mining until that regime is created. Now, speaking of India's position as a signatory, Article 18 of the Vienna Convention of the Law Treaty says a state has to, in effect, follow or not do anything that runs against the object and the purpose of a treaty that they have signed, unless and until they say, oh, we're not going to ratify it. We signed it, we thought about ratifying it, but we decided not to do it. India hasn't done that second step. It's only done the first step, which is that it has signed a treaty, but it had not indicated whether it would or would not ratify it. It's important to note, just for the sake of completeness, that India hadn't signed or ratified the Vienna Convention of the Law of Treaties. So while I refer to Article 18 of the Vienna Convention, I do so because Article 18 reflects binding customary international law, not because it is a treaty that India is party to. Getting back to space law now, one of the recent developments that had happened in October 2020 is that there were negotiations between the space agencies in the United States and 5 other countries that resulted in the signing of the Artemis Accords. And the Artemis Accords, of which Australia is a party, along with Canada, Italy, Japan, Luxembourg, the United Arab Emirates, the United Kingdom, and of course with the United States, they set out some fundamental rules as to how they are going to regulate or protect, more like, their activities on the moon, on Mars, and other celestial bodies such as asteroids. And part of that involves protecting private industry as well as governments in mining activities, and also protecting their revenue and their profits from being able to sell off the minerals that they extract from outer space. These rules and regulations that they have negotiated and agreed between them are based on the freedom in Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, so no reference to the Moon Agreement, in relation to the freedom to use outer space and its celestial bodies for themselves. Of the 6, now 7, because Ukraine has since signed on to the Artemis Accords, of the 7 countries that have signed them, only Australia is a party to the Moon Agreement. India is not a signatory to the Artemis Accords, and as far as I'm aware, there are no imminent move on the part of either India or the United States for India to sign on to the Artemis Accords. And I was privileged in last year to have some involvement in advising the Australian government in relation to the Artemis Accords. And I would suspect that there are elements of the Artemis Accords that would be unpalatable to India. So in terms of privatizing the space mining sector or the future space mining sector and the role that India can play, there are ultimately 3 things that India can do as a nation to take advantage of this potential area of space, leveraging India's current scale of development and involvement in the space sector. The first is, as I suggested in the previous slide, to seek to negotiate with the US and accede to the Artemis Accords, as Ukraine has done. Secondly, it can choose to ratify the Moon Agreement and then call a review conference under the Moon Agreement to start negotiating that foreshadowed regime. At least start to move the international community towards embodying the Moon Agreement and creating an international regulatory framework that is not just limited to the United States and their friends. Thirdly, it can legislate on private or some hybrid being government and private space resource ventures to provide a competitive regime as compared to other countries where there might be advantages in relation to insurance, there might be advantages in relation to regulation, advantages in relation to insurance indemnity that may attract space mining ventures to be based in India and be funded by other developing countries or by Indian sources, and in fact steal a march on the Western enterprises that are seeking also to extract resources from asteroids and either bring them back to Earth or to use them in space. I hope in the last 15 minutes or so, I've given you a, I hope, informative snapshot of the Moon Agreement to supplement what Professor Bhatt has done in relation to the other major issues to do with privatization. Before I finish, can I say just as a can I just say to I'm certainly emboldened to see so many students and young scholars who are participating at this conference. 23 years ago, when I finished law school, space law as a subject didn't exist. And in the last 23 years, despite never having studied space law, I have advised governments, I have advised launch operators, I've advised satellite operators in space law, a topic I never in fact studied. The message I want to say to you is that in a world where there are far more lawyers than the rest of the world would like to see, if you have ambition in space law, if you have a strong interest in space law, then by all means pursue it, because the opportunities that can come from hard work and dedication is probably more prevalent in a field like space law, which is emerging, than other areas of established areas of international law or industry sectors where you may have been taught and been involved in. There are opportunities that are arising now and plenty of opportunities that will arise in the next 10, 20 years to come. And so if it is what you want to do, if it is what you're interested in, don't let other people say to you, oh yeah, it's a very small, obscure field that only 2 or 3 people get to do it. Well, I can tell you, at least on my own example, that that's not true. Thank you very much.